Hi, everyone. I'm Maria. I have the honor to chair this panel here today, our last literature panel. And we have three presenters today, and I think I might start right away with introducing our first presenter. Christopher Smith is an assistant professor in modern Japanese literature. His research focuses on Heisei and Reiwa literature, as well as Japanese pop culture, including manga and anime. And he recently published a translation of Tanaka Yasuo's Somehow Crystal. Christopher, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome. Greetings from Florida, where it's quite early, so hopefully my kids won't wake up and run in. I apologize if they do. Let me start sharing my screen. Okay. So my presentation is the Enemy is Us, 21st Century Anxieties in the Imperial Past in Asai Inyo's Dead Demons. So Asai Inyo is most famous. You might know him for his manga Oyasumi Pun Pun. If I can get this slide to move. There we go. Which features a protagonist drawn as a sort of hastily scribbled duck among a world that's otherwise rendered in great detail. And sometimes features photos and other kinds of collage. So he's therefore known for offbeat and experimental expression. In this paper, I examine his current serialization, and I'll say the title once, Dead Demons, Dead Destruction, or Dead Demons, Dead Destruction, hereafter just Dead Demons, which has been in serialization in Big Comic Spirit since 2014. So Asai moves to a more realistic visual style with this manga, but the story remains experimental and offbeat. The manga creates an alternate present world where a flying saucer hovers over Tokyo after a disastrous failed invasion that killed tens of thousands and now sends out waves of invaders. However, this ongoing invasion and the military response to it have already become routinized. Mere background noise to the lives of the characters. So I argue that this text metaphorically summons many present-day anxieties: the 3/11 triple disasters, conservative politics and remilitarization, the dehumanizing effects of technology and social media, the increasing power and reach of large corporations, etc. However, the metaphors are not one-dimensional and straightforward, and the text mixes them for interesting effects. Most importantly, I think, it pointedly creates associations between the alien invaders and World War II era Japan and the Japanese imperial project. It therefore summons anxieties about immigration for one thing, but uses those anxieties to propose that the invasion to be feared the most is the invasive persistence of unexamined or lingering ideology from Japan's colonial past in peaceful present-day Japan. Since this past is unexamined, Japan risks sliding back into militarism and xenophobia that characterized it. So the manga follows two high school girls, Koyama Karode and Nakagawa Oran, during the last days of their compulsory education in Tokyo. Their lives are peaceful and mundane, and they engage in ordinary activities such as online games and outings with friends. However, hovering over their peaceful lives, literally, is the oppressive presence of a giant flying saucer. 3 years prior to the narrative's beginning, this flying saucer staged an invasion of Tokyo, causing massive destruction and the deaths of more than 80,000 people. In the middle of this invasion, however, the US military dropped a so-called A-bomb, or A-bakudan, on the saucer, a weapon eminently evocative of, but not explicitly, an atomic bomb. Since then, an area of Tokyo roughly corresponding to Ota Ward has become contaminated with A-rays, A-sen, and is uninhabitable. So the saucer was not destroyed by this bomb, but was apparently severely damaged, as it ceased its attack afterwards and now just floats aimlessly above Shibuya. In the past 3 years, it has continuously sent out smaller ships to attack Tokyo, but these seem rather feeble and are easily intercepted by the self-defense force. So in this disaster, which occurred 3 years earlier in a manga which began serialization in 2014, in which tens of thousands died, which has left a lingering threat of environmental contamination, the manga has clearly created an allegorical representation of the 3/11 triple disasters, the earthquake and subsequent tsunami and meltdown that occurred on March 11, 2011. The parallels don't stop there. The aliens' assault began in Odaiba, but the famous Odaiba Ferris wheel miraculously survived. So it's now called the Miracle Ferris Wheel, Kiseki no Kanansha, and locals are trying to get it registered as a cultural treasure, clearly evoking the miracle pine tree or the Kiseki no Ipponmatsu that survived the 3/11 tsunami in Rikuzen Takata. So the invasion, which occurred on August 31st, has come to be referred to as 831, much like the 2011 disasters are referred to as 3/11. And there is lingering fear over A-ray pollution. We see that Karode's mother has become obsessed with the invisible threat of A-rays, refuses to take off her mask or her heavy goggles, only eats food from far out, not threatened by contamination, and belongs to a group start in agriculture in the unpolluted countryside. So therefore, Dead Dead Demons is clearly talking about 3/11, at least in part. But at the same time, it creates enough alienation from the historical 3/11 to productively comment on it, and specifically the social response to it. The legacy of 831 hovers omnipresently and visibly over the present in the form of the giant flying saucer. So the presence of past trauma in present-day life is made manifest, visible everywhere, incomprehensibly vast, undeniable, and unforgettable. It's impossible to sublimate 831 into history in the same manner that 3/11 was, framed as a singular event that must be moved on from and recovered from. The trauma of 831 looms large in mundane everyday life in the present. And most significantly, it's a continuing, ongoing threat. And this makes the contrast between the hugeness of that event and the social response to it all the more stark. So in the text, the constant threat represented by the huge UFO has become thoroughly routinized and normalized. In one early scene, Karode bicycles through a Quidditian suburban neighborhood and passes by one of the ubiquitous signs informing passersby of the previous day's traffic statistics, 0 deaths and 122 injuries. Next to this very familiar sign is another tallying the previous day's battle statistics, Kino no Sento, 0 deaths and 5 injuries. As she passes it, Karode thinks, all the important adults said that everything has changed since that day, but actually I was displeased with everyday life where nothing changed at all. So although the events of 831 represented a traumatic rupture which still hovers omnipresently over life and threatens constant violence, it has already been absorbed into the everyday, the Nichijo of late capitalist Japan. It has already ceased to exercise power to shock Japan out of a malaise of boredom, or what Miyadai Shinji might call the endless everyday, owari naki nichijo. As a metaphor for 3/11, we see that Dead Dead Demons heightens the ongoing danger and disruption represented by 3/11 in the form of daily invasions and battles to highlight the absurdity of the lack of any meaningful change in response to the event. Any energy for meaningful change or reform was quickly absorbed by the momentum of peaceful prosperity, the peaceful prosperity of the status quo, and the everydayness of late capitalism reasserted itself. And with a kind of ironic prescience, the text discusses the government's plans to completely ignore the obvious and hovering state of emergency and go ahead with the Olympics. However, the UFO and its constant attacks are more than a simple stand-in for 3/11. The text also represents many other 21st century social anxieties normally submerged, but forced to bubble up to the surface by the threat of constant invasion and perhaps as well by the 3/11 disaster. One of these is rising nationalism and militarism. So we discover, for example, that weapons manufacture has emerged as an important economic sector. So at one point, a journalist cheerfully reports that while Japanese firms fell behind in the production of electronics, thanks to the stagnation in household appliances, a very real phenomena, of course, we can now expect them to bounce back as they pioneer new weapons technology. An electronics CEO in a farcical parody of corporate PR announces his company's new catchphrase is, even weapons are environmentally friendly now. Heikidate ekonoji da dayo ne. And explains his new weapon is a cost-effective and ecologically friendly green ray laser. When the laser vaporizes one of the smaller invasion ships in a violent display, citizens gathered in a public square cheer and begin a nationalist chant, Nippon, Nippon. Here we see that the crisis has been managed in a way that totally ignores the real threat, the huge UFO, but instead benefits the capitalist endeavors of large Japanese corporations. The result is a resurgent corporate nationalism in the restoration of large Japanese the restoration of large Japanese electronics firms to the stature they enjoyed in the 1980s, which engenders and becomes entangled with more militant nationalism as citizens celebrate these firms' newfound power to wield technologically advanced violence. Later, these advanced weapons become celebrated as part of cool Japan. At one point, an overly chipper young girl idol announces a cool Japan festival as centering on Japanese culture, like manga, anime, and defensive weaponry. Nihon bunka de aru manga, anime, kokko heiki. And the new military industrial laser weapons are decorated to look like cute characters from the game Super Mario. The text suggests that the state and capital can easily appropriate pop culture in support of militarization. Internet discourse is also instrumental in this turn towards nationalism. The majority of voices online, we learn, are in favor of developing weapons and A-bombs and exterminating the aliens, while those who seek rapprochement with the aliens and are against weapons and A-bomb development are in the minority. So the pacifism of post-war Japan seems to be threatened by an increasingly dominant ideology of justified military force. The online group that favors exterminating the aliens is called the Neto Tako, probably a reference to the Neto Uyo, or the online right wing. Okay, so all of this is alarming, but to an extent understandable. After all, the aliens really did invade Tokyo 3 years earlier. An ominous flying saucer really does hover over the city, and there really are invaders constantly trying to attack. For the first year or so of serialization, or almost 3 volumes in the bound edition, the invaders themselves are not depicted, only their ships, allowing their unseen but menacing presence to grow. When they finally are visually depicted, however, they unexpectedly resemble children wearing diving helmets. They are small, unarmed, seemingly helpless. When first introduced, 2 of them cower and hold each other in front of an imposing JSDF officer in body armor armed with a gun. The visual tone of the manga suddenly shifts dramatically. Whereas before it had mostly depicted realistic, mundane portrayals of urban spaces and schoolgirls, now the text suddenly incorporates blood and gore. Visual conceits out of place. But this visual violence, seemingly from another genre, is always visited on the childish bodies of the invaders. Suddenly, the fervor for exterminating the invaders becomes decidedly sinister. It's not only the SDF that exercises violence on the small, soft bodies of the aliens. We see that there are also civilian vigilantes that take it upon themselves to hunt down and kill aliens who are in hiding. A delivery company begins having its many employees moonlight as alien hunters. Its vans now carrying not only packages, but also the small corpses of aliens. The company even produces a commercial, proudly advertising that by killing stray invaders, its workers are delivering peace of mind, anshin, and that the company is creating an environment that is safe and worry-free, anshin anzen, the ubiquitous catchphrase of contemporary Japanese society. And all this is in the service of building a strong country, Tsuei Kunizukuri. So capital has gotten involved in extreme violence now, and it uses the rhetoric of advertising and PR to justify violence and killings as necessary for a strong nation and peace and safety. The text shows school children watching calmly from their classroom, even recording on their cell phones as little aliens are violently killed by SDF personnel, their blood splattering everywhere. The government also distributes a smartphone app, Invaders Clash, which borrows the iconography of the extremely popular video game Space Invaders. With this app, citizens can easily report sightings of defenseless aliens for eventual elimination by the SDF. So violence has been gamified, legitimized again by association with cool pop cultural tropes. So this is perhaps a kind of dystopian alternate present, but this dystopia of violence exists alongside the perfectly ordinary quotidian life of the main characters as they go to school and visit cafes and arcades in urban Japan and live out peaceful, prosperous middle-class lives. The text seems to challenge any claim that such peaceful prosperity, such anshin anzen, is a moral good. It suggests instead that bourgeois life can absorb and accept any amount of violence or immorality to sustain itself. Prosperous middle-class life in late capitalist Japan is revealed as a monstrous system that will revive nationalist discourses, other the vulnerable, and do extreme violence to them, rather than face any change or threats to the continuity of citizens' lifestyles. So I turn now to the question of just who these invaders are. Who could transform Japan into a society willing to accept such violence, indifferent to it at best and participating in it at worst? Here, the metaphors are perhaps a bit muddied and not straightforward or unidirectional, But the invaders, I argue, are themselves Japanese. So when the text shifts to their perspective for brief interludes, it's revealed that they have Japanese names, like Yuriko and Stomo. On the very rare occasions when the text provides glimpses of the invaders' faces, they are depicted through photo collage using photos of faces with Japanese features. But the text also hints at specific historical connections. In a telling analepsis that recounts the invaders' thoughts when they first arrived on Earth, a child asks an adult how many humans he will be able to keep as pets, using the counter for animals, hiki. The adults tell him that humans will not be pets, but that, quote, their bodies are big and they are strong, but they're not very clever. So we're going to have them help us out with the kind of manual labor that we can do. So here we see a pretty clearly colonial attitude. The child, perhaps not yet fully enculturated in the legitimating veneer of empire, articulates frankly that the colonial other are regarded as less than people on the level of animals. The adult, meanwhile, articulates a common imperial economic arrangement, where the metropole arrogates more sophisticated, creative, industrial, and technological labor as its exclusive domain, and uses the colonial periphery peopled by supposedly less sophisticated cultures as a source of agricultural or manual labor. And this is, of course, the arrangement that Japan had with its own colonies, using places like Taiwan and Korea as sources of agricultural labor to supply rice to the imperial center. So if the invaders are Japanese, in other words, they are the Japanese of the imperial era. There are several other subtle hints connecting the invaders to Japanese of the colonial or World War II era. As the war has gotten worse for the invaders, leaders in the mothership have promoted gyokusai kakugo, or determination to shatter like jewels. Gyokusai, or shattered jewels, was a favorite militarist euphemism for the war dead during World War II. One of the aliens realizes he was sent from the mothership as a tokko butai, or suicide unit. So tokko was the word more commonly used in Japan during the war to describe what is widely known in the West as kamikaze attacks, suicide attacks where participants purposely discarded their own lives for the chance of inflicting damage on the enemy, sometimes under coercion. A captured invader defiantly shouts banzai, the wartime expression of fervent patriotic sentiment. Another recalls his oath to chiru for his nation, or fall in the manner of flower blossoms, another militarist euphemism for war death. The text also shows that the invaders have been sent out from the UFO, poorly equipped to fight humans, and abandoned by the mothership with no logistical support or hope for rescue or victory, much like Japanese soldiers and sailors in the increasingly desperate campaigns late in the war. So here, the metaphor becomes somewhat ambivalent, as the aliens are depicted as both colonizers with striking similarities to Imperial Japan, and as helpless childlike victims of brutal violence themselves. And significantly, the reversal happens after the A-bomb renders the invaders helpless. So I think we can detect a tendency noted by Lisa Yoneyama and other scholars as well, for, quote, memories of atomic victimization to fuse with those victims of Japan's own aggression and racism. Here, however, I think the conflation is reflexive, at least in a roundabout way. But what's significant is that these gestures at colonial Japan mean that the manga depicts a menacing invasion of present-day Japan by Japan's own imperial past. This then is the answer to the question I posed earlier. What could transform pacifist Japan into a society willing to accept militarism and brutal violence, complicit in it at best, and participating in it at worst? And the answer is the insidious presence of unexamined imperial ideology, nostalgia for the lost cause of Japan's empire, and the sublimation of guilt into victimization. The text seems to say that the ideologies of imperialism and fascism are still here, like a giant flying saucer, always hovering ominously over peaceful post-war Japan, a presence everyone is aware of, but chooses to ignore. It's this lingering presence of Imperial Japan that can creep through the streets and hide in homes in pacifist post-war Japan, and by doing so has the power to turn ordinary citizens living normal, prosperous, peaceful, mundane lives into practitioners of and collaborators with brutal violence. This ominous presence of Imperial Japan also has the power to make post-war Japan re-embrace militarism, co-opting industry, the state, and even pop culture to legitimate and normalize this turn. The text suggests that imperial ideology has not been sufficiently examined or confronted, and its lingering presence always threatens to distort Japan into a militarist, violent dystopia, despite the veneer of post-war pacifism and democratic prosperity. So the manga doesn't provide much hope for dealing with this metaphorical invasion by past imperialism. The aliens and the increasingly militarist Japanese government seem to be on a collision course that, it is strongly implied, will result in the destruction of the world. Meanwhile, the portrayal of a left-wing movement determined to stop the expansion of the military-industrial state vacillates between being ineffectual, only holding small protests, and descending into violent assassination politics itself, recalling how Japan's post-war leftist movement imploded with increasing violence. But the manga is still ongoing, so perhaps a solution will be offered. However, at present, Dead Demons uses a hodgepodge of sci-fi tropes to offer a fascinating critique of the presence of lingering, unexamined ideology from Japan's imperial past and the potential for the reemergence of violent nationalism in present-day Japan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christopher, for this very insightful and informative talk. I think the format is that we will gather questions in the end after all three talks are over and sort of like move on with the talks consecutively. So I'm going to move over to myself now. Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Maria. I'm a postdoctoral scholar in Japanese studies based at the University of Leeds. My research focuses on Japanese contemporary literature and Japanese film. And my current book project explores Japanese fiction of the 1990s with an emphasis on Japanese writer Abe Kazushige. And I'm going to share my screen. Okay. All right. Let me just move on. Okay, perfect. So with the interest of time, I'm going to start right away. I just wanted to thank EAJS for the kind invitation. And also, I would like to give a shout out to Filippo and Nozomi for keeping it all together and holding the fort so well over the last couple of days here. Okay. Few people outside of Japan know that multiple award-winning fiction writer Abe Kazushige is also a prolific film critic. And research has not paid any attention to the author's criticisms so far, which is why I thought it's a good idea to close this gap in my presentation today by discussing a series of 19 film criticisms published from April 2002 until May 2004 in the journal Bungakai in the wake of the 4 coordinated terrorist attacks against the United States by the Islamic terrorist group Al-Qaeda on September 11th, 2001. Instead of being an orthodox analysis of films, the series, I would suggest, is a genre-crossing hybrid between Abe Kazushige's fiction and his film criticisms, Eiga Hicho and Hyoron, through incorporating characteristic literary narrative techniques from Abe's early novels and short stories. I locate these formal experiments of the series within the literary theory of French theorist Roland Barthes, arguing that their destabilizations of the boundary between criticism and literature identifies them as that experimental writing which Roland Barthes calls écriture. By exemplarily focusing on selected passages from the first criticism of the series, entitled The Meandering of Shaky Walking, Abbas Kiarostami's ABC Africa, I will show how the écriture of it problematizes linguistic expression after the trauma of 9/11 as global watershed. Shaky Walking performs a quest for a voice after 9/11 by delaying speaking about the tragedy, a digression continued throughout the opening criticisms of the series, before the series then meanderingly but continuously turns to exploring manners of speaking about 9/11 through the mode of film critique. And we can discuss the other criticisms if you're interested, either after the presentations or also on Wonder after the session. In that sense, the critic Abe Kazushige, not discussing 9/11 in Shaky Walking, is an expression of his speechlessness after being a witness of the attacks. It is an attempt at speaking about films and speaking at all after witnessing the events of September 11th by being an elaborate performance in exactly, I would suggest, not speaking about it. Against this backdrop, my presentation will move beyond restrictions of genre in Japanese literary scholarship generally. I suggest that, on the opposite, including an author's criticisms into the analysis of their fiction and the other way around will allow for a better understanding of either side and the author's oeuvre in total. So there are obviously people also working in Japanese literary studies on the genre of Hihyo and Hyoron, but overall, as a general picture, as I've been sort of working on over the last 6 years, the genre of criticism, Hihyo and Hyoron, tends to be a little under-researched in comparison to the literary output of Japanese fiction writers. I'm going to start with my analysis. Trauma and memory studies have analyzed that being the witness of an incisive historical tragedy leads to a loss for words. Witnessing entails struggling to find the right language for expressing what one experiences as an unspeakable catastrophe. Moreover, there is an ethical stance in writing about such a tragedy for artists, according to Theodor W. Adorno's statement that writing poetry after the Holocaust is barbaric. Being at a loss for words and thus unable to write film criticisms after September 11th is also how Abe describes his reaction to the incidents in a taidan on films with fellow writer Nakahara Masaya, which took place one day after the attacks on September 12th in 2001. So in that taidan Nakahara says, "I was totally shocked. Films have become entirely redundant," to which Abe replies, "Yeah, it's impossible. I had intended to discuss what had become of Hollywood special effects in the 1990s. But after what I'd seen, I find there's nothing left." So in the conversation here, Abe states that discussing films is impossible, dame, following such tragedy, as there's nothing left, mo nani mo nai desu yo, after it. Nothing left to think or to say very clearly expresses that he is at a loss for words about the attacks. Against this background, I will analyze how the unreliable critic, Abe Kazushige, in Shaky Walking, delays the plot of the criticism, which in this case is the critique of current films, through digression, using the techniques of zigzagging, as he calls it, and repetition. In doing all this, I argue, Shaky Walking creates a hybrid narrative, which oscillates somewhere between the analytical language of criticism and that of self-conscious literary autofiction. By invoking the literary figure of a first-person unreliable narrator, Shaky Walking takes over a characteristic figure of Abe Kazushige's fiction and transplants it into his film criticism. So I'm quoting from the opening of the criticism. "To be frankly honest, I have a major problem. I have to start analyzing current films in this journal in the following, but I still have no clear outline of what this is going to look like. Because my opportunity to watch films has decreased with each year, especially and dramatically so since around the last half of the year 2000, I have missed several new works that seem important. As a result, it is extremely difficult for me to provide an analysis of the overall current landscape. Last year, I did not regularly set myself to the task and thus ended up analyzing only 2 to 3 works. And how should I say, lately my perception seems to be entirely dulled, and I even feel as if suffering from jet lag most of the time. Sometimes I would like to declare I've had enough of films. However, if I really thought that, I probably would give up writing film criticisms at all. Still, the way I watch films at the moment is with an absent, distracted gaze, an undecided, ambiguous feeling, as well as a vacuous mind." If we relate the indication of a jet lag, which he mentions to feel suffering from, to his emphatic declaration of having had enough of films, we may deduce that Abe's distraction relates to the incidents of September 11th. Tokyo is 13 hours ahead of New York, so having followed the attacks from Japan, Abe must obviously suffer an unnatural sleep cycle due to the time difference. So he is an unreliable critic who alludes to us that he has not been able to watch films because all he could do was follow the events in New York. Shaky Walking self-referentially references this connection between itself and Abe Kazushige's fiction through narrative unreliability and digression in the following passage. So the criticism goes on saying, I am at the stage where I'm exploring through trial and error and by doing to see whether I'm capable of finding a new manner of narrating. Thinking of it though, this is how most of my stories begin anyway. So neither the route towards my destination, nor needless to say, even my current location are certain at this point. The only thing I can say for sure is that it is likely going to be a zigzagging itinerary. So in this quotation, Abe Kazushige explicitly relates the experiment in finding new manners of narrating by zigzagging, rather than through coherence and teleology. The title Shaky Walking may be programmatic here, to similar experiments of his novels, which complicate representation and storytelling through the digressions of their first-person unreliable narrators. Indeed, the passage calls both the author's fiction and film criticism stories, monogatari. We may either argue that Shaky Walking here locates itself as a literary story by definition of the term monogatari, which is a term that commonly designates literature. Narrative digression is one of the trademarks of the earliest Abe during the 1990s, with most of his early novels and short stories displaying digression in varying form and intensities, as I have explored in a different piece. So Abe's early novels and short stories, we have extensive digressions in some of his novels over, so like in the case of Americanol, over half of the novel is basically a delay of the story. Or alternatively, we may read monogatari, especially with Abe, as an active indication of a nullification of genre here through a philosophical understanding of it as narrative, which monogatari also signifies. In that case, the theory of narrative would be a complement to that of écriture. In either case, it would be the indication of a boundary crossing text beyond the separate labels of literature and critique. And a second parallel, if we like, between literature and fiction is Kiarostami's film title, ABC Africa. So the film title of the chosen film of the criticism, which is also part of Shaky Walking's title, so the title of the criticism, and Abe's second novel's title, which is ABC Senso. So we have ABC here, which further cements the impression of a fusion of genres here. The unreliable narrator sets out on his zigzag way through a contradiction play, which is very similar to those of Abe's early novels and short stories, first-person unreliable narrators. Meaning Abe Kazushige seems to put himself to the task, however, only to reject it immediately after. So the text says, taking into account the global situation of after September 11th, 2001, I should probably discuss Mohsen Makhmalbaf's Kandahar. However, sadly, at this point, I have yet to see the film. While its theatrical release has already started, I have yet to see it. Again, what a negligence. So the unreliable critic suddenly seems to address the attacks by addressing their date, September 11th, 2001. He then defines his supposed task as a film critic, which is to conduct a situation analysis of current films. Accordingly, that would involve discussing Iranian director Mohsen Makhmalbaf's 2001 Kandahar, because it came out in 2001. Kandahar was shot before September 11th and got widespread attention after the attacks and is a critical take on the Taliban regime and its effects. So an analysis of current films in March 2002 would have included a discussion of Kandahar, if in explicit relation to the incidents of September 11th or not. But instead of speaking about Kandahar, after announcing that that would be the logical thing to do, the unreliable critic admits that he has not seen Kandahar. The unreliability is doubled here through the repetition. Firstly, I have yet to see it. And secondly, and with emphatic underscoring, I have yet to see it even though it is out in cinemas. What the unreliable critic turns to instead is, as he explains himself, a discussion of late Iranian director Abbas Kiarostami's ABC Africa. And this is how the criticism ends, with a rather traditional structural analysis of ABC Africa, a criticism in the generic sense of the genre in Abe Kazushige's style, which is mostly formal analysis of the films. ABC Africa is a film released in 2001 as well, but it has nothing whatsoever to do with 9/11. It is a documentary of orphans in Africa shot on digital camera. The choice of ABC Africa instead of Kandahar is another narrative delay through repetition. Because Abe has discussed Kiarostami before, his choice of discussing the same director's later film, ABC Africa, now is a repetition of something previous rather than a production of new content. And I quote, "Therefore, no misunderstandings, please. I will almost not at all refer to Mohsen Makhmalbaf's Kandahar this time." So another sort of underscoring here. Even the fact that I will discuss Abbas Kiarostami's ABC Africa, do I have to mention that both directors are of similar Iranian descent, does not mean that I have any other intentions. The choice of Kiarostami, how many times have I done this before, is uninspired to begin with, slightly intolerable indeed. However, as I had decided to write on ABC Africa upon having watched it, there's nothing I can do about it. How many times have I done this before? Refers to the fact that in discussing Kiarostami, Abe Kazushige repeats himself. The author's very first film criticism, Ken Loach and Abbas Kiarostami, The Shot of Gaze and the Open Film, appeared in February 1995 in the journal Bungakai. So rather than producing new content, which would have been a discussion of Kandahar by Mohsen Makhmalbaf, a director never discussed before, Abe Kazushige repeats himself by discussing Abbas Kiarostami, the director of his very first film criticism. As such, the repetition is another expression of Abe Kazushige's speechlessness, as I would suggest, about September 11th. Rather than saying something about September 11th by discussing Kandahar, the criticism says something old and thus, in a way, does not actually say anything. Shaky walking itself explains the repetition by making it part of Abe Kazushige's self-proclaimed project of finding a new language, which he announced, as we remember in the opening of the criticism, where he said, "This is a way for me to find new manners of narrating." Having said that, the first manuscript which I submitted to this journal was an essay on Kiarostami. At the time, I attempted to do a comparative analysis with Ken Loach's work, as both filmmakers have in common their oeuvre's documentary touch. I do not want to imply at all here that there is another connection, but well, it makes me believe that I have returned to my beginnings. And from next time on, I want to write more and more film criticisms, and by doing so, explore all kinds of things. Also because I expect new perspectives to open up through this process. Note that all of a sudden, the zigzagging of the unreliable critic meanders into something meaningful at this point after all, in terms of his quest for a voice. In returning to Kiarostami, Abe declares he returns to being a beginner again, so he returns to his own beginnings as a film critic. As a beginner, he approaches the language of criticism as a newcomer. Encountering it afresh gives him the possibility to explore it in original manner. In that sense, the repetition is productive rather than regressive, as I would suggest, as it fulfills the function of resetting Abe Kazushige to a position from which he can approach writing with unfamiliar rather than familiar eyes. And as we all are familiar with, Russian formalism points out that that exactly is the precondition for art itself. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult. Being able to make the familiar seem strange through defamiliarization is the outset for any creative experiment. So what is shaky walking overall? Let me come to an end before I move over to this presentation's conclusion by suggesting that shaky walkings is the performance of digression through Abe Kazushige as unreliable critic, before he turns to exploring speaking about 9/11 through the mode of film critique in subsequent criticisms of the 19 criticisms in total series. Shaky walking itself remains mute about 9/11 until the end. The film ABC Africa ultimately turns into an image of the sky as Kiarostami and his assistant take an airplane home. While the airplane finally might be an image that one may use to discuss directly the attacks of September 11th, the criticism keeps it focused on exploring the possibility of speaking rather than actually speaking, by discussing the depiction of an Ugandan toddler adopted by an Austrian couple. Accordingly, the last sentence of Shaky Walking asks, Will she from now on have to wonder about the labyrinth of Europe and the US on shaky legs? This rhetoric question may relate to the unreliable critic Abe himself, who from now on has to walk into the following series on shaky legs, not knowing how the series will turn out. The cover image of an Ugandan toddler on a rope of the poster of the film may also be a self-reference of the unreliable critic Abe Kazushige to himself in that sense. So what can we conclude from all this? Being an observer of September 11th seems to have muted Abe Kazushige and stifled his creative imagination from what he says. However, I argue that this claim is part of a performance. Indeed, the opposite seems to be true. Not being able to speak about the incidents on the content level of the criticism is part of a quite inspired creative performance that spotlights criticism as a narrative experiment in form by delaying the content. And this is exactly also how trauma theory argues. I'm quoting Kathy Caruth here. If traumatic experience is an experience that is not fully assimilated as it occurs, then these texts, in each in its turn, ask what it means to transmit and to theorize around a crisis that is marked not by a simple knowledge, but by the ways it simultaneously defies and demands our witness. Such a question, whether it occurs in strictly literary or in a deliberately theoretical text, can never be asked in a straightforward way, but must indeed also be spoken in a language that is always somehow literary, a language that defies, even as it claims our understanding. With regard to September 11th, this narrative delay may also be a testimony of how critiquing films seems to have become secondary to political and personal concerns for the state of the world. It reads as a quite purposeful statement of a political awareness of Abe Kazushige here, for whom non-political creative activity seems trivial after a historical caesura of similar scope. And Adorno's quote from the opening may resonate here. Note that Abe Kazushige overall, throughout the series and in other criticisms, such as an article published on September 17th on his former website, so 6 days after the attacks, straightforwardly takes position against the reactionary politics of the Bush administration after 9/11 and also the Koizumi government's support of the US in the Iraq war through dispatching self-defense forces to Iraq in 2004, thus entering a war zone for the first time since World War II. 2001 marks the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Recent publications in Japanese literary studies, such as Saito Minako's Nihon no Dojidai Shousetsu, Jin no Toshifumi's Sensou e Bungaku e, and Suzumura Kazunari's Tero no Bungakushi, while only remotely, have emphasized how important 9/11 also was as a topic in Japan for post-bubble Japanese literature. Jin no Toshifumi suggests that Abe Kazushige addresses 9/11 also indirectly in literary works, such as Shinsemiya, the only literary piece serialized at the time of September 11th, and his Akutagawa Prize-winning novel Grande Finale, while only indirectly. Still, we may find that Abe Kazushige consistently, not least, expresses himself on 9/11 in his film criticisms as well, meaning not in literature. In that sense, I hope that my presentation has shown that literary studies will benefit from taking into account consciously the critical output of Japanese fiction writers, especially because it is characteristic of Japan, as we all know that many fiction writers simultaneously are also critics, and especially because literary studies has specific tools, as I would suggest, to analyze criticisms as the text that they are, which may allow us to go beyond content-based or interdisciplinary approaches, as done in intellectual history or films and media studies largely, where the genre is mostly discussed at the moment. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we are moving over to our third speaker today, Julia Baquet, a PhD candidate in Japanese contemporary literature at Ca' Foscari University in Venice. Julia's research focuses on including Japanese contemporary literature into the broader field of eco-criticism. And her dissertation focuses on contemporary representations of environmental disaster in Japanese literature. Julia, dozo.
Okay, thank you, Maria, for the introduction. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, I hope you can see my presentation.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, then without further ado, I will just get into it. And first of all, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here and for having me. I'm very happy to be speaking at this EAJS conference as a PhD. For me, it's like as a PhD candidate for me is a very important step I'm taking. So today I will try and share with you some preliminary thoughts on the shifting paradigm from victim to survivor in the aftermath of a disaster, and in particular of environmental disaster. And this is a very preliminary stage, so I'm very much looking forward to the final discussion and, of course, to any comments that you might have. For this presentation, I will take into account Taguchi Rendi's Zone Nite as a case study. The novel was published in 2013 by Bunge Shunjo. And I think this novel is an interesting case study as it was published after the 3/11 disaster, but it's also part of a series of novels and short stories by Taguchi Rendi that tackle several environmental issues such as global warming, deforestation, and garbage production and illegal disposal. So therefore, Zone Nite is not a self-standing novel inspired by the 3/11 disaster, but rather it could be seen as an integral part of Taguchi Rendi's existing environmental concerns. As a result, the novel can be analyzed as a connection between Japanese ecofictions and the so-called post-Fukushima literature. So the novel Zone Nite is divided into 4 chapters, and each of them narrates a specific aspect of life after the triple disaster that hit the Tohoku region in Japan. The character linking the 4 stories, the 4 parts, is Hattori Yoko, a 39-year-old novelist and journalist who travels to the zone, to the exclusion zone. In her trip, and then later to the temporary shelter, she's accompanied by Kudo Kenichi, a middle-aged man survivor of the disaster and who owned a house in the in the current exclusion zone. The story shows, for example, the 20-kilometer zone surrounding the Fukushima Daiichi reactor. And we have then a description of a temporary shelter housing the survivors of the disaster. Or, for example, in the last part, we see 2 women living in a place called Nekosoko, that is a semi-permanent evacuation area. And it is interesting to see how the novel is characterized by continuous movement across the border of the exclusion zone. However, in the novel, the space of environmental disaster is not only a scarred place bearing the signs of the past earthquakes, tsunami, and then the nuclear disaster. It rather becomes a space where there is also possibility for emotional recovery from the disaster in the first place, but also from previous and sometimes forgotten traumas. So in order to understand how a contaminated place, such as the exclusion zone, can become a place of recovery, change, and compassion, I would like to introduce Smith's suggestion for a perspective change. So Smith describes the feelings towards environmental degradation and pollution of those of us who are trying to live eco-consciously, he mentions, but they're part of what he defines settler culture. So people living in settler cultures are mostly aware of the damage they're imposing on the environment, on non-human beings, and also on other human communities as a result, in particular, of their economic practices, but are unable to take action. And people living in settler cultures who try to live eco-consciously often feel as victims themselves of their own culture and of the environmental crisis. So therefore, Smith suggests to see ourselves as survivors rather than victims in order to move from a sense of helplessness and passivity to one of action and possibility to make lasting change on our societies. While at the same time, I also want to introduce you to an ethnographic study of survivors' recollections of Hurricane Katrina made by Lindell and Hall, and he proposes that the same perspective shift, so basically could expand on the concept of survivor, and also opening up not only to those directly affected by the disaster, natural or man-made, but rather he tries to propose a concept of survivor that includes everyone who lived through a traumatic experience. And according to Lindell, he was faced with the fact that everyone is a survivor in their own way when contacting Vietnamese community to ask their support in reaching Vietnamese Americans affected by the hurricane in order to include them in his study. So at the beginning, he wanted survivors to both tell their stories and collect their own and other survivor stories. However, he was made to realize by other members of the Vietnamese American community that everyone in the same community had gone through some other form of trauma, even though they might have not been directly affected by the Hurricane Katrina. So, and basically they put him in front of the fact that in the end, we're all survivors. And therefore, in Lindell's studies, having survivors tell their stories becomes a way to give them back their agency in the face of the disasters they experience, but also to reposition them in an active role after being branded as victim, who passively accept and endure their fate. As a result, when dealing with those affected by environmental and natural disaster, both in human and in the non-human realm, because it's important not only to consider human life as affected by disasters, but also all what surrounds human life, so the non-human. It's important to shift the perspective, and shifting the perspective to survivor rather than talking about victims could be a productive way to allow them more agency in defining their own stories. And also in particular, when it comes to the non-human, seeing the non-human itself as a survivor rather than victim, a passive victim, could allow us to give them back an agency that too often we attribute only to humans, and also to recognize the suffering that the non-human is also enduring, especially in the case of environmental disaster. So in Taguchi's zone Nite, we see how the zone, despite being contaminated and polluted, can become a sort of healing place, a place of connection and recovery for both the human and the non-human. So, for example, we have Yoko's sister who died in a plane crash. And so basically the disaster in which the sister died is completely unrelated to the 3/11 disaster. But for Yoko, the zone becomes a place of connection, an almost nostalgic place where she feels as if she can meet her own late sister. And it seems as if the zone is for her a place to reconnect with her without feeling the trauma and experiencing the trauma all over again. So Yoko becomes in her own way a survivor of her own trauma. Also, the non-human is directly affected by the disaster, and it becomes in the novel a survivor of the 3/11 disaster, while the zone seems to become a place for recovery. So the grass is often described as green, and there are many descriptions, especially of the grass, and it's always very green and very lush. And insects are also very present during the trip that Yoko takes to the zone. Despite, of course, knowing that the non-human, so the natural landscape and animals living in the zone are most likely polluted and contaminated with radiation, we have this knowledge, but it seems as if nature is finding its own way to recovery, growing and coming back despite the disaster. Animals, on the other hand, are less present. So there is not that much presence of especially living animals. But what is interesting in the novel, and to see how the zone can actually become a way to overcome a past trauma and also to overcome the trauma of the disaster itself, is that despite the images of carcasses and dead cattle that are present in the narration, especially in the first part, these images are generally reversed by the sudden appearance of living animals. So, for example, Kudo and Yoko are visiting a farm, and they found several dead cows whose carcasses are rotting in the heat. But suddenly, however, Yoko steps over the carcasses to move toward the calling voice of Kudo, and she sees a lonely cow standing almost absent-mindedly on a hill. And the cow, despite the environment and despite the knowledge that the environment, and so probably also the cow who was left in this zone, is contaminated with radiation and high level of radiations, the cow looks pretty well, looks good, looks almost healthy. And a similar scene is also present when the two visit an ostrich farm that once even had a restaurant serving ostrich eggs. But first, there are remains of ostriches, but then again, suddenly an ostrich appears and it even starts following Yoko. And in this case, there is a very liberating laugh that both the characters have after this sudden encounter with animals. And it seems as if this laugh is kind of a way to acknowledge what's happening and also their own way towards recovery. So kind of acknowledging that despite the suffering, despite what's going on in the zone and the contamination, there is still something that can be learned, and that's something, and nature can always recover in somehow. The last part of the novel, on the other hand, we see two women, one who has been diagnosed with a new kind of depression, and it's mentioned that it might be linked with the disaster. While the other, the other woman was forced to leave her community. So these two women, they live in a semi-permanent evacuation area, the previously mentioned Nekosoko, and they are one of the best examples in the story of how the novel shows the disasters and how the exclusion zone can become a way to recover from previous trauma and help the characters move from a status of victims to a status of survivors. So the two women, despite the high concentration of radiation, live off the product of the earth. So they live off vegetables that they grow themselves. And after society refused them, they settle in a place that has been hit by the disaster. So they refuse social norms. They seem to refuse social norms, and their lives are extremely physical. They dance and they sing often. But also what is interesting is that they have this idea of associating man and humanity, the idea of with the idea of coexisting with nature. So it's a theory, and they say it's all on the human side. So in the aftermath of the disaster, we often talk about coexistence or cherishing natures, but this appears to be only a theory that does not take into account the agency of the non-human. And again, so it's all on the human side. So these two characters, on the other hand, are trying to reframing agency as something that is shared by the human and the non-human in the same way. And also, they're trying to acknowledge that also the non-human can be affected by a disaster, especially a man-made one. But for them, the zone and the semi-permanent exclusion zone, it's not a place of only trauma, but it rather becomes a place for them to recover from their previous experiences. So it becomes, it's kind of transformed in a space of recovery from their previous trauma. So having lived through the 3/11 disaster for one of them, but also for the other, the trauma and the suffering of being excluded from her community. So in conclusion, I would like to bring some further reflections. So first of all, and probably the most important one, is if this shift from victim to survivor is indeed relevant in a Japanese novel and more broadly in Japanese ecofictions at large. So the terms I put here, so kiseisha, higaisha, seizonsha, hikinokori as well, are not mentioned in the novel. And I'm also still trying to clarify if approaching ecofiction, Japanese ecofictions, with such a shift in mind, so moving from the concept of victim to the concept of survivor, could bring about the positive and active mindset that we associate with the English terms. Also, another point that I think it's important and needs to be further discussion is the issue of witnessing and who can talk for the survivors of a disaster, especially in the aftermath of an environmental disaster. So in the novel, Yoko is challenged several times about her motives to visit the zone, and she finds it difficult to give a straight answer. She mentions that she goes there to collect information, but nothing more. And when she's asked if she wants to write about the zone and about the disaster, she's not sure about that. Also, when Kudo asks her what she wants to see, she appears uncertain and she doesn't know what to say to him, basically. So according to Katie Carruth, in the case of a traumatic event, the act of seeing, so in the very establishing of a bodily referent, erases somehow the reality of an event. So in the case of Yoko, however, maybe her not knowing, her uncertainty seems to be her ability to bear witness. So she doesn't know what to see. And from this perspective, her inability to see becomes the way through which the survivors and the various witness of the disaster can express themselves. And also the way through which people who experience the disaster, but also experience previous trauma, can use the disaster to heal from both the traumatic experience of 3/11 and of their previous trauma. So Yoko's relation with the people in the zone allows to avoid the erasures of the event and gives the chance to people in and outside the zone to tell their own stories of trauma and recovery through the environmental disaster. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Julia, for this, again, very interesting and insightful presentation. And we have a couple of questions already in the chat. I think we can just start right away with taking questions. I'm just checking what we have in the chat in terms of questions. Please feel free to also just raise your hand and
that might be easier if
okay.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, no, absolutely no problem. So please feel free to just raise your hand and speak up and chime into the discussion. I see a comment by Atsuko Sensei about the notion of unreliable narrator in Shaky Walking, which I've just quoted. And thank you, Atsuko, first of all. That is, I think, a very, very interesting and for sure relevant point that you make here, which I will copy and paste and take up into my notes. I think it's a bit of a tricky question with Abe Kazushige in general. And I think what you address here and what your comment emphasizes is that the self-conscious, as you also mentioned, the self-conscious aspect of Abe's literature in general. So his fiction, he sort of identifies as metafictional writer, and then also of the series, which is obviously also a bit of a metafictional comment on his literary narratives, on his fiction. So basically the self-conscious is a little bit like he is sort of mimicking the sort of like unreliable narrator that he is sort of first initially performing in his fiction, or that his text sort of perform, the figure of the unreliable narrator that his text perform. So to a certain extent, this impression of sort of that this is really an elaborate performance of really sort of like putting into question sort of cognitive abilities, putting into question his capabilities of being an apt sort of critic is almost so exaggerated that it seems as a bit of a self-conscious sort of a metafictional sort of reference. And I absolutely agree with you. I think we could, like, if you sort of in a sort of turnaround gesture, absolutely say, okay, he is so honest about his limitations. Is it then like from the other sort of side, from the opposite, is that then not a sort of a reliability, which I find actually really fascinating here. I think that is a really, really interesting and valid comment to make. I would sort of probably say that he has these contradiction plays sort of he sort of like he lays out what he should do. So he sort of has the unreliable narrator who sort of who violates valid social norms, basically in sort of like, or becomes incredible, and sort of like he lays out what he should do, and then he deviates from that. So we have like this sort of thing here, but he is so honest about it. Indeed, he is so really, really honest about that. You could say, okay, that is then in turn, is this not then sort of a notion of honesty or reliability here, which I find fascinating. Thank you very much for that. Any other questions? Yes, please. V.
Yes, sorry, my name is V, and I have a questions for Professor Christopher Smith about your presentation. So it was really fascinating because I also write a paper. I did not specifically talk about the manga like you said, but I wrote about the Seikaikei subgenre about post-apocalyptic theme in Akira and also Neon Genesis Evangelion, and I feel like they have shared the similarities of speaking about some sort of like post-apocalyptic theme in which you express sort of like the frustration for after like a really big event and crisis. So my question with this is, what do you find any, like I said, any similarities between those sort of genre, and what would you categorize this manga? Is it also the same with Seikai's subgenre? And also, what do you think is the purpose of voicing the undertone of the militarism and fascism, and what can be contributed to the sort of like association with the art between arts and politics, or namely the politic movement of post-Fukushima? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I don't know if this manga is Seikaikei, because Seikaikei usually focuses on like a romance, and there's not too much romance in this one. But there are a lot of similar elements, and of course, the big one is like the sort of parallel existence of like the end of the world, something apocalyptic happening, and sort of smaller stories about characters that seem almost unconcerned with the end of the world, right? And I think that's definitely here. I think one thing, however, that in a way in which Dead Demons is a little different is that the apocalypse is kind of like already forestalled, right? It's already, so like in Seikaikei, the apocalypse is almost kind of, it's there, but it's almost kind of incidental to the lives of the characters, but it's there, right? The world is ending or has ended. But in this one, I think that like the big attack happened, the apocalypse happened, but it's already been reabsorbed into late capitalism. So in this text, I think comments more than anything on the impossibility of apocalypse, right? There's no kind of exteriority to late capitalist, Japanese prosperity. There's nothing left, even the disaster of 3/11 didn't really change anything, and the disaster of 8/31 didn't really change anything. So all that's left is to sort of go through the motions of the endless everyday, and like there's no apocalypse would be almost optimistic at that point, because it would mean something could change. And I think that's the kind of commentary that you see in Dead Demons. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Any other questions from the panel or from the audience?
Yeah, if nobody else has anything to say, I can ask something to Julia. So first of all, I was happy to listen to such an interesting presentation on Taguchi Randi. I think a bit more research should be done on her. And it's surprising to see that all the people that I know that are researching Taguchi Randi are Italian, including myself, Silvia, Anna, and other people. So my comment is very general. What you mentioned in using all the terms for survivors, Seizonsha, or by even the Tobosha, or by people that are fleeing, they're escaping, made me remember something that I heard at a conference by Numano Mitsuyoshi, who said that after 3/11, we're all Bomesha, so we're like exiles and things like that. So I was wondering what you think about that, and if you think that could have any bearing on what you said about this fluidity of the zone between life and death in Taguchi Randi.
Thank you very much for the question. It is very interesting to see also the term Bomesha used, because I have to admit that I'm having this a bit of a struggle, and because I think it's a very productive shift, but it comes from environmental philosophy. So it's a completely different field. It doesn't really relate to literary criticism. And especially, of course, it comes from an English language based environmental philosophy. So I was a bit, it's something that I'm still thinking about, it's like, how can I apply this shift, and how can it be productive? But maybe the term Bomesha, especially in relation to the zone and the fact that it becomes a bit of a fluid environment. So it can be a productive term, because I think in the novel, at least, there is this in Zone Nite, there is this continuous movement across in and out the zone, and across kind of life. I don't want to say life and death, but kind of what it's basically, kind of life, but there is this continuous reference also to death and to contamination and pollution. And there is, what I also thought was very interesting is that the zone seems to become a marginal space, a liminal space in which the boundaries becomes blurred. So also the boundaries, for example, they mention at a certain point at the very beginning of the novel that maybe also the boundaries between human and the non-human, between humans and animals, are becoming a bit blurred, because people who should flee the zone, they go back to the zone rather than be conscious about the contaminations and the pollutions of the radiation, and they flee. And also, I think the people who stayed, because it's mentioned there that in the novel someone stayed, but it's associated, like Kudo mentions at the beginning, that maybe they just stayed because they were looking for a place to die in. So maybe they were elderly, or they had some illnesses, but they were still like kind of going back to the zone again, in this kind of blurring of boundaries between here and there. So maybe, yes, maybe we are kind of exiles also, for both those who fled from the zone, but also maybe from those who are going back to the zone as a way of being exiled from kind of their experience maybe, and kind of finding a way to deal with their experience of the disaster. Because what I also kind of am still thinking about, it's how to approach Taguchi Randi's writing on 3/11. Who has the right of to talk about a disaster, or who has the right of discussing an event? But I think if we look at the more general survivor term, rather than looking only at victims, then we're kind of all maybe survivors of this 3/11 disaster, also those who were not directly affected by it in the exclusion zone. So maybe they're also exiles in their own way of their own experience, and they're kind of finding a way to deal with their own experience. But these are just like very random thoughts, so I don't know if I really answered your question or if it makes sense at all in general.
No, definitely it does, and thank you. And also, I think that the idea of being an exile, it means that also you're looking for a way back. You might be looking for a way back. So we are exiled from a zone, something happened, we are exiled from this process. But I think it also somehow harbors the idea that one could struggle. It's like a titanic struggle to find a way back. And this idea of fluidity emerges in several writings that were propelled by 311. I can't help but think of things by Takahashi Genichiro again. So you are life and death. So he writes that we are in a place where death is seen as the negation of life. So that in a way we should go back to an idea where we see that death is also present of everyday life that could make us consider things from a wider perspective. And I do not think it's very dissimilar to what Taguchi is attempting for a similar circumstance. So thank you.
Any other thoughts, ideas, questions? Please feel free to just raise anything that that comes up. Go enryo naku.
Can I say something?
You saw something. Oh, perfect. Great.
Yeah. Well, can I say something?
Sure, Filippo, please.
Well, of course, I will give precedence to the audience if they have a question. But so what I wanted to say something to Maria, which is more of a comment. So I was really glad to listen to a very interesting presentation on Egao Boigaki that I'm trying to get around to reading, but I haven't. So thank you for giving me a very thorough primer. And so it strikes me that, as you also mentioned, and the other considerable piece of fiction that Abe was engaged in at the time that came out was Shinsemiya. Mm-hmm. Which is very different from, I mean, I have an idea about unreliable narrators there, but let's say that in a way it's very different from some of his previous narratives about the character that is played. So, and also some of the things that you quoted from Egao Boigaki reminded me of Musou no Sekai. Mm-hmm. And the thing at the end where he said, like, this might have happened, but actually maybe this was just me seeing something that I thought it was something else, so please help me. So sometimes it feels to me that these unreliable narrators in Abe are asking for help in a way. It could be an ironic thing. It's like, well, I'm here.
Great, yeah.
In the écriture, I'm trying to say that I need help. Maybe I don't, maybe I do, which is really fascinating. But what I wanted to say is that how do you consider that in 2004 Abe published something like Egao Boigaki, whereas at the same time, fiction-wise, he was doing very different things, writing, for people who don't know, Shinsemiya is a huge family saga. It's like the Hood and Fox of
You're working on it
Tohoku.
right now, exactly, yeah.
I'm very curious about your thoughts on that.
How I understand that he was sort of serializing something so sort of like
more
that.
Let's say more structure. I don't know.
Yeah, more structure. I sort of to be honest, I think this is a really interesting question. Thanks first of all for the point on sort of the unreliable narrators asking for help and sort of the.
We have to talk about this some other time.
Yeah. We can totally. It's super interesting though with the question to the witnessing and everything, which trauma narratives are also about. It's basically like it is about communicating and about voicing a certain experience, which is sort of difficult to put into language, and then also about establishing a dialogue with someone else. So I think. That is actually a really relevant point. With regards to Shinsemiya, if you're interested in the question of sort of 9/11, the sort of like the only sort of literary narrative that Abe serialized at the time, indeed, of 9/11 was obviously Shinsemiya. And Jinno Toshifumi, Sensoe Bungaku, I can really recommend. That is basically the Japanese literary scholarship on 9/11 in Japanese literature, and he's a fan of Abe, so I think sort of his major sort of investigation into senso bungaku, how he sort of calls it at the time, sort of started a little bit with Abe, and he sort of says that he was reading Shinsemiya at the time, was serialized in Shosetsu Torippa, and he was really waiting for Abe to sort of react to that, and then it didn't happen, it didn't happen, it didn't happen. Then finally, I think March 2002 was the serial came out, and then Jinno basically says that Shinsemiya is super indirect about it, as much as Grande Finale is indirect about it. So if you sort of want to look for 9/11 as it is sort of normally referenced or indicated in Japanese literature or Japanese scholarship, it's like the Arabic numerals Q and then and colon and then ichi ichi. And so this is basically, we have no such indication in Shinsemiya or in Grande Finale. But if you're interested in that, in Kozui, the fourth part of Shinsemiya, there is, which came out in March 2002, that is exactly the same month that the first criticism, Shaky Walking, came out as well. So there is a bit of a parallel here again. And there is basically speaking of a sort of like tsunami, or that sort of came to Japan, and then we have two sort of drunk characters, Hoshi Akage and Tanuki Sensei, who sort of like drunk, and then they think that the rain or everything that's falling on them is it's aerial bombing, it's war, it's carpet bombing or something. And so according to Jinno Toshifumi, if you want to follow him, he says that is for him basically the first time that the word senso was sort of mentioned in Shinsemiya, and for him that is Abe's sort of 9/11 reference in Shinsemiya. And then if you want to look into Grande Finale, in Grande Finale he has actually in the opening, the first person narrator, pedophilic sort of narrator, he sort of thinks about something entirely else, and then he thinks, okay, thinking about September 11th of last year, and then he starts sort of talking about it, that he sort of turned on the TV, and then he saw those images, 9/11, again, not referenced, is indirect. He saw those images, and there we have, interestingly, what we do not have in the criticisms. We have the psychology of the witness, basically. We have affect, we have emotion, we have shock, we have not being able to grasp it. We have all the affect that's Abe sort of like buries under either a language of avoidance or sort of like irony in the criticisms. We have, all of a sudden, we have, if we sort of want to understand it like that, as readers, some sort of indication or representation of some actual affect. So we could say that sort of here again, his sort of criticisms and his fiction are sort of complementary, in that we have here what trauma theory calls the vicissitudes of witnessing, the sort of like the sort of like the affect of the witness, basically. And he also says that he was watching, he really gives us the whole sort of theory on the witness in Grande Finale for someone. He was sort of with billions of other people, so a community of witnesses. We have the sort of transnational sort of connection here. So that is definitely a fascinating topic to look into. Also with this fiction. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
if that is of any interest.
Also, this is a wonderful parallel. So if you could give me the reference by email, text later, thank you. Yeah. And it also, made me aware of, in your paper, you talked about Abe writing about writing sometimes, like, oh, how many times have I done this?
Yeah.
And I think that if there is one novel where people talk and talk and talk redundantly, and they don't say anything, is Shinsemiya.
Yeah.
so there's another interesting bridge there, I think. Thanks you.
Much. No, thank you, Filippo. Thank you so much. I hope we can continue the dialogue.
Definitely.
Definitely. Oh yeah, I'm the chair. I think we have 10 minutes left for other questions from the audience on any of the three papers. I may have a question to Julia, and apologies if you have pointed this out during the presentation, but I saw this one quote where you were talking about man, and there was like this indication of otokotte. So, and I was just wondering, have you sort of thought about the fact that this is sort of a gendered thing? It's sort of like, because I sort of, as a gender person, we sort of tend to see gender in everything, but I was wondering if you have sort of reflected on that in any sort of, if you see anything in that, or if it's just.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Maria. Yes, because so I really like the novel, so I'm using it in many different presentations. And I also gave another one at the PhD symposium some months ago. And in that presentation, I was exactly looking at the gendering of disaster in this particular novel by Taguchi. And I think in this case, what I found more interesting is that is this two women. So I was linking like the gendering of the disaster kind of thing with the liminality of these two women who are kind of living in, again, in this marginal position. So they're living not completely in the zone, but not really outside of it, because it's a semi-permanent exclusion zone. So basically what I was thinking is that it seems as if they're kind of saying, at least to me, it appears as if they're kind of mentioning again that the disaster, it's something that is man-made, men, so otoko, but also men as humanity. But they are, on the other hand, try to link back again to this connection that is also is not only men, it's not only otoko, it's not only humanity though, but also like the non-human. And also their experiences as women's marginality, again, they're kind of trying to reassess after the disaster, and they're kind of reassess their own marginality in the face of disaster as women, and they're kind of trying to recreate this association with an environment, a non-human environment that has kind of gone through a suffering, and they position themselves in this kind of suffering environment, suffering non-human. So it was to me as if they were kind of losing their humanity, and they were kind of, it seems as if they are kind of redefining themselves as part of this liminal environment. So nor men nor women, just living in this semi-permanent exclusion zone. And there are many other, like, there are other issues in other parts in the novels as well, where I think the disaster is very gendered. But I think this one is like the most clear example of how this disaster is man-made, but it's also like really otoko made, not really like women's disaster. So I don't know if I really answer your question, or if you have any other comment on it, because I would very much looking forward if you have any idea or any other thing.
No, I think that's that's certainly very interesting. No, thank you very much. That was a really interesting answer, and sort of still leaves me sort of thinking about it. It's definitely thought-provoking. Thank you very much. I have a question to, has anyone else any questions? I mean, Ina has a question. Ina asks, Christopher, 2 short questions. I was wondering how you would interpret the manga's title against the backdrop of your reading of the manga. Could you tell us something about the reception?
Thank you. Yeah, so it's hard with Asainio and titles, because again, he's really offbeat and strange. But so obviously he's using a lot of like repetition and strange titling. But I think that there's a reasonable interpretation. I haven't wanted to make this claim yet, because the manga is still ongoing, so who knows what's going to happen. But that the dead demons are in fact sort of the demons of the Japanese past, right? And they're causing dead destruction. But there's other weird stuff going on in the manga. There's at least one time travel thing going on. So I don't want to kind of make that claim yet. But yeah, I think there's a kind of reasonable. It's reasonable to kind of make that leap, I think. In terms of reception, I'm actually not really sure. I haven't been back to Japan, in a couple of years because of everything. But it's still ongoing. As far as I know, it's still very well received in Big Comic Spirits, which is a kind of seinen manga magazine. But I certainly haven't heard any buzz about like a anime adaptation or anything that would indicate extreme popularity. But yeah, that's about what I know about it at this point. Thank you.
Okay, with perfect timing. Thank you very much, everyone, for the questions. We've reached the end of this session. As a chair, I can say thank you very much to everyone. Thank you very much to my co-presenters. Thank you very much to Nozomi and Filippo for moderating, and thank you everyone who attended for these amazing questions today. And I think Nozomi, Filippo, would you like to say anything?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. No, well, of course, we're wrapping up. Thank you for the wonderful speakers. We were really happy that we could end the modern literature section with such an interesting panel, new avenues of contemporary Japanese literature. So I think we more or less, despite technical difficulties and some people that unfortunately could not attend the conference in the end, I think more or less we had a good balance between contemporary and modern Japanese literature. So, and I'm glad to say that we have some interesting questions and discussions. Hopefully they will carry over other discussions in the future and projects. So thank you all the speakers, the audience for your questions, and Maria for chairing. So if Nozomi wants to add a final word.
Oh, thank you. This is the last panel for the modern Japanese literature. So
oh wow!
but
Yarimashita.
It was great.
Yes.
It was fantastic. I just really want to acknowledge that this has been really difficult year for everybody, and the world is kind of collapsing. But I'm really grateful that we could have, even online, we could have this kind of moment of discussing academic academic discussion on the modern Japanese literature. I understand that a lot of people have carrying responsibility, not having a space to do so, but also we need to acknowledge that we need to keep going for the academic discussion for this. And I really thank all of you and also Filippo to bring this together this year.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And on just personally, with all the challenges, and also the fact that the organization of the section has taken 2 years, even more. It was great to be able to work with you. I honestly could not have done this organizational work without you. So
Even work